I'm getting the feeling that Formula 1 simply doesn't know what it wants to do. It's already a mess with the FIA and Formula 1 bickering amongst themselves with how it wants to involve American interest. Formula 1 apparently wants American money and eyeballs on its actual product, yet doesn't want American involvement with teams or anything like that. F1 wants to add sprint races to make the at-track experience more valuable, yet the FIA is not kept in touch with Parc ferme conditions to allow some tweaks to the format to make it more workable for teams. As a result, it's just left F1 looking completely and utterly incompetent. Like it simply doesn't know what it wants to do with its brand new toy that it's so proud of, yet it really doesn't know what its definition is supposed to be. Is it its own championship? Sprint qualifying? Sprint whatever? I'm just sprinting toward the exit at this point. After last weekend's US Grand Prix, it just makes them look like a bunch of plankers. I talked about the situation briefly in my winners and losers video from yesterday, but the fact of the matter is that the rule itself, the one that's caused so much controversy right now, really could do with some working for the modern age right now, especially when you get the likes of the FIA being scrutineered themselves by the general public. The consensus being is that if you get 2 of the 4 randomly selected cars actually testing positive for excess wear on the plank, then all of the remaining cars should be actually checked for the excessive wear themselves. Clearly, there is a problem here on that track that really needs to be investigated. This isn't an isolated incident, because this could actually be a huge problem that could actually disqualify maybe even more drivers, and especially since COTA itself, the track is really bumpy this season. Many of the drivers and the teams have reported excess bumpiness because of the fact that COTA is built on wetland, so things undulate over time. So no matter how many times you resurface a track, you do come up with bumps that you really didn't expect to see. And it's clearly something that COTA really needs to get on top of and fix big time, especially when you get the world champion lambasting it and making your track to not be worthy of its FIA Grade 1 certificate. That's a real shame too, because the drivers and the fans really like the track when it's not bumpy and it's actually meant to be as it's intended to be. Can you imagine the furore and the anger online if Max Verstappen wasn't one of the 4 that was checked? There would have been pandemonium online. Lewis Hamilton being singled out, yet Max gets to get off scot-free! No. But it does make you wonder, who else fell foul of this? Lance Stroll maybe? Diminishing his returns from P7? Because Aston Martin's floor, they changed that, he had the new floor, so maybe they were actually wearing their plank down a lot. Logan Sargent perhaps, because he had a cleaner race than Alex Albon? Or maybe the other Ferrari or other Mercedes? Carlos Sainz and George Russell may have been at fault too, because, they were on similar setups and Ferrari was struggling to raise the ride height in time with the limited practice time they had. And then the new floor with Mercedes, maybe George was falling foul of it too. I just think at the very least, if you get a car testing positive for excess plank wear, then the sister car should also be checked as well. If it's impractical to check all 20 cars after the end of the race, you can at least just check the corresponding teammate to make sure that maybe this was just an anomaly on one car instead of a team-wide thing. We'll never know because it's too late to check because those cars are off down to Mexico. So how did this all happen? Well, it comes down to 2 words that we have heard all the time during an F1 race weekend, but yet we hate to hear. Parc ferme. Basically, once your car enters Parc ferme conditions, you can't touch the car again without incurring penalties or starting from the pit lane. Now, for a typical race weekend, it's absolutely fine. After you actually go out of the garage for Q1, you are effectively in Parc ferme conditions. You cannot change anything except the tyre pressures and the front wing angle. That's all you can do. But for a sprint weekend, when you've got so many stop-start things, you've now got sprint qualifying where you've got your own parameters, and once you've done FP1, that's it for the entire weekend, it's just simply not workable. The FIA doesn't really seem to be interested in adapting these regulations for sprint weekends, and all it's doing is just making it look like a complete and utter joke. You can't even check the floor and the plank without having to do extensive work and breaking Parc ferme conditions. That's what Alpine had to do for Baku. They realized that their ride height was too low, they had to go in, they couldn't check it that easily. You can't just go down on the floor and go like, oh, that's a little low. You can't do that. You'd have to raise the car, and according to Parc ferme conditions, oh, that's changing and manipulating the car. Pit lane start. It's just, I think it would just be a little bit easier for the teams if they can actually check the ride height and whatnot a little bit more easily. Maybe then they can actually go, oh, okay, we don't actually need to change it, and then there would be no penalty incurred. You can easily have an FIA marshal there just inspecting what you're doing, and you can actually report to them exactly what things need to be changed or checked. And this really should make a lot of sense because This original rule was brought in the interest of safety back in the 90s. This wasn't just something to curb performance for the sake of it. It was done to save drivers' lives. But what this really hammered home, much like the track on said part, is that the current rules aren't really addressing the changing weekend format. Everyone wants its sprint cake and to eat it, and the FIA is simply not budging, saying the rules are the rules. And all of this is just making the sprint format look even worse in the eyes of the fans. Like, it's completely not worth our time, it just looks silly, the drivers don't like it, it's just casting a really bad cloud over it. The teams can do nothing about it, and the FIA doesn't really seem to care about it. They just shrug their shoulders and go, well, that's your own problem, mate. You should have used the time you had to make sure your cars were legal. But on a race weekend, when you only have 1 hour of practice, you can't dial the car in properly, especially on a really bumpy track for that season where you don't really have the data, and then you have to do 400 kilometers worth of racing on top of that. It's a lot to take in, with limited research. It's another case of the two main bodies of the sport at odds with one another. Yet another weekend that hasn't been marred with some kind of rule confusion or controversial incident like we got in Qatar that gets the hackles of the fans up. What can be done to stop it? Well, I mean, what you could do quite easily is just give us an FP2 session on Saturday morning. You can maybe release the cars from Parc ferme, so that means they can make some tweaks to the setup, so that means they can actually salvage something from the weekend. Sure, the damage has been done for Sunday's grid, but you can maybe try and salvage something in the sprint shootout and the sprint itself. Then you can actually go into SQ1, lock them back in Parc ferme conditions again, but it just means that the teams have actually got something to chase instead of just going, oh, well, that's it, that's our weekend ruined then. Or what will actually make it look even more embarrassing on the grid, kind of like an even bigger thing we got in 2005 at the Indianapolis Grand Prix, is that you're going to get teams going, you know what, we had a really bad qualifying, let's just bring the cars in, break Parc ferme, start from the pit lane, just change things and make it so that means things aren't so bad. That's what Haas and Aston Martin did. They realized they got their setup wrong because they only had FP1. They didn't have a second practice session to dial things in a little bit more and correct some of the issues, so that means they can make it somewhat usable for the main race. So you just got 4 empty car slots on the grid. Unless you're Lance Stroll, of course, you just went to the grid anyway. I wouldn't be surprised now that this has set a precedent. Aston Martin did benefit quite a bit from this. They changed Alonso's floor back to the old one, and he was running really well. Lance Stroll, he got P7 in the end, and he actually was reporting some good stuff. There's no drag issues. Lance Stroll actually had the fastest speed in the speed trap. So that's telling you something, that there is something to this brand new upgrade. So they just thought, you know what? Let's just pull our cars off. I wouldn't be surprised if you see more of that at sprint weekends, where you just get teams pulling their cars off the grid, starting from the pit lane. It doesn't really matter. We just think that will actually benefit from the setup change anyway. And then you might get half the grid not on the grid. That's just going to look embarrassing. Just give us an FP2 and you can change some things on approval with the FIA, and that would be simple. That would be a really good change. You wouldn't have to change the sprint format at all. And then maybe you wouldn't have had Mercedes underestimating their suck. And the changes from the qualifying to the sprint itself, that might throw up some surprises as well. And also for the race itself, you would have cars out of position with a better setup and them trying to salvage something going up the grid. That could be exciting too. And it would also make it fairer for the teams, and they won't feel like their entire weekend has been compromised. They can actually get something out of it, and there's a little bit more intrigue and mystery into the actual experience itself. So, okay, what are the F1 bods considering to change the sprint format? Because every single year we've had the sprint weekend, we have seen the format change in some way. Terminology changes, the prize changes, you don't get to run around in a truck anymore, you get medals, no, sorry, you get commemorative plaques, it keeps changing. Well, what they are considering is turning the sprints themselves into a championship in its own right, with its own points table. These points not counting towards the main championship, so you won't get Max winning his 3rd title on a Saturday again. How about a cash prize for the sprint champion of maybe up to $1 million if they can find the right sponsor, F1? Which I don't think will be a problem, because they've gained a lot of sponsors in the last couple of years. And hey, it might be yet another thing for Aramco to slap their logo on. They just seem to be doing that a lot. But what this all tells you is that F1 doesn't hate the sprint format, it just doesn't know what to do with it. The teams aren't entirely against the format, they think there is actually something in it. Christian Horner does like the basic idea, but feels like there isn't enough jeopardy going into it. It's just a bit dull. And Max Verstappen said so himself. And many of the other drivers have said that you just kind of lose some of the intrigue and you lose some of the mysteriousness and the interest and the delight of Sunday, where anything could happen. If you see what happens in the sprint, chances are you're going to get the exact same thing happening in the main race. If you can actually throw some things in, like maybe a little bit more of an incentive with some cash money, or maybe you can do reverse grids like they do for the F2 sprint races. That means you get the top 8 actually being flipped around, so 8th starts first and first starts 8th for the sprint race. That might be cool too. But you feel like there is going to be quite a lot of resistance here. Not just from the team principals, because you get Toto Wolff being quite conservative and not wanting reverse grids or anything like that, whereas Christian Horner does, because it makes things a little bit more interesting. I think Max Verstappen would agree. But you'd also have to get the FIA on board, allowing a little bit more leeway in changing things around. So that means things that happen in the sprint race can be rectified for the main race itself. So that means teams aren't left on the back foot, and therefore that takes out some of the intrigue and mystery for the fans as well. I feel like there is an ultimate solution. They've just yet to find it. We have seen the sprint format change since 2021, and every single year it will keep on changing until we get something where everyone actually likes it. What we're actually starting to see though is that some tracks do not work as a sprint weekend. Austin doesn't work. But what we do know works are the likes of Interlagos, the Red Bull Ring, Silverstone. Those 3 tracks definitely work as sprint weekends. They are a lot of fun, which is why I'm looking forward to the Brazilian Grand Prix. Maybe the new Albert Park with the very long bendy straight at the back. That could be quite a little bit of a challenge as well. But all the changes that they have made are making it more and more clear is that the FIA is really incompatible with actually bending over backwards to make F1's situation with the sprint all the more easy. They are in the business of scrutineering, they're not going to budge on that front. Especially when you get Formula 1 management and the FIA fighting over Andretti's right to join the F1 grid in 2025. They're quite clearly at loggerheads with one another, and they are not going to be capitulating on this particular format. There is a lot of bad blood between these 2 organizations, and I feel like the sprint weekend is just yet another example of F1 wanting to do its own thing, and yet the FIA is going, well, we have rules and we're not going to change them. But one thing is absolutely clear. F1 is not going to be getting rid of the sprint format. They love it too much. They are going to try everything to make it work. And it just feels like it's just going to get all the more embarrassing, or alternatively, some of these changes could actually work. But just give us a second practice session and open up Parc ferme a little bit. Even if it's just changing the rear wing or suspension perhaps. Something that can make the race a little bit more interesting. That's all you need to do. You don't need any more gimmicks, just a second practice session. The sprint format is getting there. Very, very slowly. Much like how I feel like McLaren has been getting there slowly in getting back to the top of the grid. As you can find out more about if you watch this video next.